Welcome to episode 16 of the Frog Rack podcast. Today we are joined by a dart frog breeder who has been a reputable part of the hobby for nearly 4 decades. I'm very excited to hear from him about his journey through the hobby and his perspective on things as they've changed over the years. Welcome to the show, Patrick Nabors from Saurian Enterprises. Thanks for joining me, Patrick.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah. Let's dive into some autobiographical storytelling. When did your interest in reptiles and amphibians first start?
I was always out in the back, playing in the woods and playing in the creek and enjoyed that sort of thing. That was, growing up in the late 60s and 70s as a, little kid. That was always a focus of mine. I loved, just getting out there, turning over logs and seeing what's under them. I had a few snakes, had a few lizards as a kid. And then, through my teenage years, I really I didn't live in an area where I could do that sort of thing. And it didn't really occur to me or whatever. It just wasn't, my thing. And then, I started to really know what got me into this idea, but I had all Missouri aquariums, and then that went from that where I would go out and catch like darters and things like that and keep them in an aquarium, which unfortunately didn't work out that well with their need for cooler water. But it was still fun. I loved getting out in the creek and catching amazing little fish. And then in my early 20s, when I had my first house with my wife, I got some fence lizards and kept them in a terrarium that I built. And then I found out about day geckos.
Yeah.
And I had a pair of gold dust day geckos that I set up a 20-gallon aquarium for and kept them. And they were very shy, but it was just like, it kind of lit me up, it really fired me up, got me really interested in it. So that's kind of
Yeah. And so, you became an adult, you were working a regular job, but at some point in the early 90s, you opened a reptile pet store in St. Louis. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, so the day gecko thing, and I had someone had actually, through my wife, given me a trio of tricolor, Epipetabates tricolor. And I just, over the course, I tend to, when I really get into something like this, I'll just dive in and learn everything there is to learn. I read all the, books, and it came to my attention, as it were, that, you could actually reproduce these animals, and that there were other people that were interested in buying them, and that this might be a way that I could afford,
Right.
because it's not, pull $400 out of your pocket and buy some animals with no end. That $400 is gone. Whereas if the $400 is going to actually make more, potentially produce some income, then it's possible to justify getting more animals.
Yeah. I think we've
so,
all
yeah,
discovered
right,
that factor of this hobby.
Exactly. And, basically, like you say, I was working as a manager for a country club, and I'd been in food and beverage, as a waiter and that sort of thing I was in my mid-20s, for 10 years, and I enjoyed it, but I really thought, boy, if I could do this business, this reptile or amphibian thing, that would be amazing. And my wife and I talked about it and decided that once things reached a certain stability in her job, that I would open this reptile store. And unfortunately, the reptile store, no sooner did I quit my job and plunged headfirst into getting this reptile store open, some things came up with her job, and we wound up having to move. And it was unfortunate, because it was a nice little store and business was going really well. But as soon as we had to move, that was pretty much the end of it.
Gotcha.
Her job was at that point, I was putting everything I made back into the store, and you don't open a store like that and expect to be pulling down a big salary or anything.
Right. Yeah. Small businesses don't tend to turn profit for like 3 years.
Right. So when we had to move, I decided that perhaps a better niche, so to speak, in the business was just to breed and to sell to the public. My reptile store, I had opened it with the concept of mail order. It was going to be like, there used to be a store in Florida called Glades Herp.
Oh yeah.
And while I knew I didn't have anything like the connections and, that they had, that was kind of my business model where, there'd be a mailing list that would go out and people would order things and I would ship them to them. And that really worked well. And so I took that mail order part and, closed the store down, and I stopped doing any, really buying animals to resell and just focusing on breeding. I did a lot of bearded dragons, and I really wasn't doing at that point dart frogs. There were, some dart frogs that came through my store and I thought they were amazing. And I'd already had the tricolor dart frogs, but I wasn't really breeding them at that point. I was aware of them. But when I closed the store down, I just focused on larger lizards, some leopard geckos, bearded dragons, water dragons, Australian water dragons, basilisks, monitors. I did a lot of
Wow.
monitors. I bred quite a few monitor species, when basically next to no one was breeding monitor lizards. In 1994, 1995, there was very little monitor breeding going on. But they're not very good for home and clo
Yeah, right.
I used to breed Argus monitors, and, I had a couple of pairs, and, those things make the basement smell like, there's a homeless person down there that doesn't have a toilet that's using it. So anyway.
So how did you, with sort of like a wide variety of interests in lizards and trying to make a go at being a animal breeder, how is it that you ended up with dart frogs, and how did you avoid going down the snake rabbit hole like so many other people did?
Well, that's just it. There were already a lot of people, colubrids was a huge thing. And I've, I mean, I pretty much got it covered, you got, and I don't, snakes, they go in little drawers and compartments. And,
Yeah.
I really like lizards. And in fact, my reptile store was called the St. Louis Lizard Company. I was definitely a lizard guy. And geckos, when I bred the bearded dragons and things like that for the commercial aspect of it because they were sure, they were good sellers. But I had some of the very first crested geckos. That's a story that I could tell but I traded a bunch of bearded dragons for, 4 crested geckos that were offspring of animals that almost certainly had been smuggled directly off of, I didn't really know. But it was within a year of that Reptiles
Yeah.
magazine issue with Frank Fast and Philippe de Vajoli, where they had, rediscovered the crested geckos. But here's the thing. Geckos, I became very frustrated breeding geckos because there would be interest in, let's say your Australian velvet geckos, your northern velvet geckos, and so I'd be like, all right, I'm producing, I'm probably going to produce like 15 or 20 of them this year, and I'll sell some of them, but I'll keep like half of them back and I'll get a little bit bigger colony. And then, so 2 years later, nobody wants,
Okay.
I raised the offspring that I could have sold and I put them together, or I traded with other people and I got some good, a good little colony of them going. And now this year I'm going to produce 40 of them. Nobody wants them.
Yeah, the
The
popularity
phase
cycle.
is gone.
Yeah.
Yeah. I found that I ran into that over and over again with geckos, and somewhere right in that time frame, I started keeping dart frogs. I really don't remember exactly what, turned the tide, so to
Yeah.
speak, but, I started keeping Tinctorius and Aratus and Leucomelis and, um, wow, these things are relatively easy to breed, and there's an interest in them. There's a pretty, you know, good customer base, good hobby group of people that are interested in them, and probably took like, 2 years, maybe 3 years or so for it to just kind of push all the other stuff,
Okay. Yeah.
most of the other stuff out. I still kept, you know, gargoyles and cresteds, and which were nowhere near as common then as they are now, but they were still fairly, they weren't real rare. I still kept some stuff, but I got rid of all the larger lizards and really became more and more focused on dart frogs. And that, by the time I moved from that, like I said, my wife and I moved from St. Louis up to central Illinois, where we lived for about 5 years. And then I moved back to St. Louis in about 2000. And when I moved to St. Louis, a buddy of mine that used to work in the restaurant business was, burned out on that. And he was interested in coming to work for me, even if he couldn't make very much money to start
Yeah.
with. We built, a really big frog breeding operation there in St. Louis starting in about 2000.
Yep. What in the late 90s, what was it like growing a dart frog collection? As far like, were there many other breeders you could buy from, or were you buying a lot of wild collected stuff? How were you even finding what was available for sale?
Yeah, that's that's funny. Anybody that's in their like 20s, it will be like,
Yeah.
jaw
What
drop.
do you mean?
Kind of. So there was when I first started getting interested in dart frogs, say in the mid 90s, the only real network or whatever you want to call it was, you could use the phone and you could call people that were listed, you could find their numbers from other people and network. And there was a guy named Chuck Powell who lived in California who produced a newsletter. And it was, like 4, 5, 6 pages, uh, you know, printed on both sides, stapled in the corner and folded over and mailed out. American Dendrobatid Group, I think is what it was.
Yep. For people who
And
don't know, Chuck is the one that started American Frog Day, the event that
yep,
continues almost every year to this day.
yep,
Yep.
yep. So yeah, and there'd be a couple articles in there written by hobbyists. It was sometimes the articles would be written by Europeans or would have
Yep.
been copied out of a European newsletter. And then, the real treasure, so to speak, or whatever was the classified section
Right.
back, and that you could post classified ads and people would put in there what they had for sale and then, their phone numbers and you would call them up and you'd, send them a check. Nobody did any credit cards or anything like that. PayPal had not
Yep.
emerged and or a cashier's check or something like that. And then they would send you the animals. I actually acquired a lot of my frogs. A guy who's a founding member, so to speak, of the American dart frog hobby named Mark Pulowski. He hit me up when I still had the reptile store. And, you know, over the years you just accumulate, or by having a high profile store like that, you accumulate these oddball customers who, and I had this monk, totally serious, this monk who was in a, what do they call it? A cloister or, whatever.
Yeah,
He,
sure.
he was in a monastery. He would make comments about being, he could only call me at certain times because he wasn't really supposed to be doing this at all. And he had some frogs and somehow he had some connections. And one day he wanted to send me some silver stone eye that
Yep.
he had. And I had already talked to Mark once or twice. And I knew that Mark Pulowski was like, would kill or die for some silver stone eye. I wound up driving, across one state to another state, like mid Indiana to meet him and give him the silver stone eye. But I got some F1 Azurius and stuff like that that I could actually use in my breeding program from him. And then for a while, I would I bred crickets in my basement,
Oh yeah.
um, only to the, like 1/8 inch size, but I use them to feed my dart frogs, and I would ship those to Mark in exchange for some of his offspring. Because I mean, in those days, Azurius were hard to find.
Yep.
They were $150 a piece, um, and so anyway, there was a pretty limited number of frogs. Most of them were not a wild caught, but there was certainly some wild caught stuff. There would be wild caught stuff that would show up here that came from Europe that wasn't supposed to be wild
Mm-hmm.
caught, was not represented as wild caught, but then turned out to be. I can tell you at a later point about some bicolor that I got that were wild caught that I found out they were wild caught because my fingers
Yep.
my fingers burned.
Yep.
Those were supposed to be Terribilis, by the way. They came in the United States with Terribilis paperwork, but they were the golden bicolor, kind of like those, what are they called? Aruba
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Arube or whatever. Anyway, sorry, I wander off and you just have to bring me back to the
That's all
point
right.
you're,
Well, another thing I was wondering, when you were first getting started, you were bold enough to fill your basement with dart frogs, which a lot of us can relate to that now. But were you confident from the onset, like with some experience breeding lizards, some familiarity with the exotic animal industry? Were you fairly confident that you could make a living selling dart frogs as you were growing your collection?
Well, um, personally, I mean, there's slow days and busy days. There's slow months and busy months. There's lulls but the hobby, anytime it's slow, it's just, I kind of go, oh, that's good because other people will get out of the hobby.
Yeah.
Has never really, let me down, so to speak, never really slowed down. There's always been an interest. So yeah, I've always felt confident that if I produced it, I could sell it with some, I mean, maybe not every frog species is
Yeah.
going to be a hit, but yeah, I knew I didn't have any doubts that, and here's the nice thing. For me, I was not the head breadwinner. If I'd
Hmm.
continued in the restaurant business, I would have, within a few years, I would have been the general manager of a country club, and I would have, I'm sure, I would have made, the big salary, but I would have also worked, New Year's Eve and
Oh,
Mother's
yeah.
Day. It's just not a good life for a family. Man, I didn't finish college because I just never really could figure out what I was going to do with my degree. And so I kind of got stuck in the restaurant business. And when I landed on breeding reptiles and amphibians, I really felt like I was doing something I could really enjoy. And fortunately for me, my wife, my long suffering, wife, has been involved in the medical. She's a nurse, she's a nurse manager. And while the jobs have been somewhat unreliable because of downsizing and whatever mergers and that sort of thing that go on in hospital groups, the salary is good, and
Right.
her hours have been, regular 9 to 5 work. And so when we started having kids in the later part of the 90s, it just made sense that, I mean, if I stayed home and I worked out of the house, then if I made, $40,000 a year or whatever, less, it still made sense because we didn't really want to be those parents that, drop their kid off at daycare at 6 weeks old. And, so my
Yep.
being, employed from home made a lot of sense while we had kids, and allowed, a lot of flexibility with their schedules and them not being coming home to an empty house or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I've been employed from home since 2016. I do a fair, and frogs have helped make that possible. It's not the only thing that I do or that my wife does for income. But yeah, for the same reason, time with the kids, we even homeschool. So I have time to get all the frog room chores done, work on my homestead. I also sell a whole bunch of permaculture plants, which are like nut and berry bushes and fruit bearing trees and things like that, from a different website. So I really enjoy growing things, whether they're plants, gardens, frogs. So I've been able to, similar to you, make that work from home, which is nice.
Yeah.
I'm interested. So you mentioned very early on, posting classifieds on paper that was going to be mailed to people was a first way of marketing. I just want to contrast that to today. We all know that the world has changed at a rapid pace, but here we are in 2026, and someone could, for the very first time, become aware of the existence of dart frogs. Like, right, they could have not even known that they were an animal that existed. The idea of dart frogs could come into their awareness, and within a few moments they could watch YouTube tutorials all about all the different kinds and how to set up a tank. And then right there from their couch on their phone, they could order an enclosure and plants and supplies, hop on a couple websites, choose the frog they want, add it to cart, check out, demand overnight shipping, and have the frog at their home less than 24 hours later. Um, so and that's sort of the Amazon.com-ification of our society, that we've all
Right.
become very used to that. I'm curious, not just I'm not just curious about how things were, but I'm curious over the 35 years you've been selling dart frogs, what markets have you preferred to sell into? Do you vend a lot of expos? Do you do a lot of online sales? Like for you, what has worked the best as your way of marketing and selling frogs?
Well, back in the day, as it were, when I really like, let's say 2000,
Hmm.
I'm really doing frogs. Doing a lot of sales and producing a lot of frogs. I would have a display ad, small, in Reptiles magazine, and the internet existed. I had a website by then, but e-commerce was not really up and going at that point. People still generally would call and place orders over the phone, and so in that time frame, I really fondly remember. I mean, I helped so many people get started with dart frogs because they would, I mean, in no world would you ever go out to the mailbox and have a check in there, for, four green and black erratas and a
Yeah.
fruit fly starter kit. And, please ship this to my house. And, don't, because then at that point in time, I mean, I guess there was email and stuff, but I typically talk to people on the phone
Yep.
and I walk them through how to set up their terrarium, how to raise their frogs, how, and then they would ask questions and I would help them with all those aspects of getting started. And, I miss that today. Today, I get, $1,000 order from somebody that I don't know anything about.
Right.
And all they want me to do is let them know, when I can ship their frogs to them. And, you know, so I always ask, you've got fruit flies, you know what you're doing, kind of,
Yep.
but I mean, I, a lot of them, honestly, I don't think, you know, they don't know what they're doing with their first frogs, and that's unfortunate. And that's always been my one of my resentments was the people that would sell, the little bitty frogs and not give very much advice about how because those people that bought those little bitty frogs that didn't get their hand held a little bit about how they shouldn't just go dump them into a big old terrarium that they just set up. The frogs die, and then the people were like, "Oh yeah, I always heard dart frogs were hard. I
Yep.
guess they are." And so I'll go on to, you know, I'll get tree frogs next time or
Yeah.
something.
I just vended a reptile expo last month and several different as the whole entire crowd walks by your table at some point and I heard that maybe a half a dozen times. Cool, dart frogs. Yeah, I tried those, but boy, they're so tricky cuz mine died
Yeah,
within weeks and like I didn't have time to engage people cuz they were really just telling their friend as they
yeah,
walked by, but I overheard it. And I was like,
yeah.
they're not that hard. There must have been something you missed that someone didn't
But
help you be aware of.
and they think they know. I mean, it's like half the customers that I get now. I do my best to reach out to them, and if I manage to engage with them, I find out that hey, guess they've got this terrarium and they built it. It's their first terrarium build, and they're planning on putting the I mean, first off, I'd never let anybody buy four Azurias from me without being like, hey, what are you doing? You want a pair? Are you gonna raise these separately? What are you doing? But even if they bought like four, let's say green and black Eratas, I'll find out that they're planning on putting them into this, 36 long by
Mhm.
24 high by 18 deep Exoterra. And, well, maybe you should send me some pictures of that. And they send me the pictures and it's got, cocoa husk on the bottom that you can tell as soon as the frogs hop into it, they're going to be
Yeah.
breaded in it or something. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the resources that are out there on the net are apparently not as good as people think they are because a lot of my customers, and they've spent this hobby attracts wealthier clientele, or at least it requires a bit of money.
Yep.
The frogs are expensive, and then so you get these people that have a bit of money rolling around, and they don't question that they need a misting system and they need, a custom built lid for their
Mhm.
tank and they need LED lights and, hygrometer and, couple $100 worth of bioactive stuff in there. And then by the time they reach me, hey, you've got the frogs I want. Can I get these frogs from you? And we backtrack and go through their setup. And I'm like, man, I could have saved you hundreds, hundreds of dollars. And, your setup needs a fair bit of work. And oh, by the way, if you would have come to me 6 or 8 months ago, you could have raised those frogs in some small individual enclosures and they'd be ready to go in that terrarium now. But now, you're going to have to buy larger frogs and spend more money, or buy these smaller frogs that I mean, it's like a pyramid, everybody sells tadpoles. And so there's tadpoles, and then there's froglets, and then there's juveniles, and then there's, larger frogs. As you go up that chain, the selection gets smaller and smaller until you get to the top where you've got adult frogs or sex adult frogs. And that's the least selection. I think I'm the only person in the hobby that routinely carries sexed, adult frogs or
Right.
larger frogs. I mean, I know they're out there, but the majority of the animals sold these days are tadpoles, which is something, maybe we'll talk about later. But,
Sure.
um,
Yeah, I've discussed that with a few other guests. Is this relatively new phenomenon of selling dart frogs, and then those of us who really just want to buy some froglets can't seem to ever find them because they stay out of stock because they seem to be sold as tadpoles first. Another thing I sort of bemoan is just how small, and I've mentioned this on the podcast, just how small some froglets are. They seem some reptile
yeah,
expo vendors and
yeah,
even the dart frogs, whoever is supplying Petco with dart frogs is sending them at like 2 weeks out of the water. It's nuts.
yeah, yeah.
It's just setting people up for failure.
It is setting people up for failure. And the other thing that it does, which is really frustrating to me, is that the people, not necessarily Petco, but the people at the expo that are selling the Azurius or whatever, let's say,
Yeah,
for 20, they're 2 weeks old, or they're tiny and they're cheap. And
right.
so then that price tag, whatever it is, $30, $35, you might as well, in the customer's mind, you put $35 equals Azurius.
Mm-hmm.
Then there I am over at my table with my, 5-month-old juveniles that are, you know, the size of the end of your finger, big jelly beans with legs that,
Yep.
um, and those are $50, but they're going to buy the ones for
Yeah.
$35
Yeah.
there because they're $15 cheaper. And it's just an Azurius. Somehow their brains don't go, oh, look how much bigger that one is.
Right. Yeah,
It-
and we all sort of have a vested interest in this issue because if someone's first experience keeping a new species ends up being bad because they bought a 2-week-old Azurius and they put it in a
yeah,
giant enclosure with
yeah,
the wrong
yeah,
substrate and the frog dies in 2 weeks, they're probably lost from the frog hobby for good.
right.
They might not
That's
try
exactly
again.
it. That's
And
exactly
so,
it.
yeah,
Yeah, it makes me mad at those vendors, at those breeders who sell those animals, because those people are, well, I mean, I'm going right past the unethical
mhm,
aspects of it and going straight to the part where it hits me in the pocketbook, because those people that bought those frogs are going to be, like we talked about, they're not going to be keen on the dart frog hobby. And that's why I always
right,
like to
right.
hold their hands, so to speak, those beginner customers. I'd like to get them when they first, hey, I'm really interested in getting into, and I haven't done anything.
Yep,
That's my ideal customer, and yet that is like the white elephant. I mean, it's just rare that I get that customer, because people, and it is this. I mean, people tell people to call you; they'll text you instead. That's how we've become. I'm the same way, but that's how we've become at this point in time. And so people sit in their little, you know, bubble, and they research everything online, and they talk to, the people on the Facebook page that they're on, and half the people on the Facebook page that they're on are just, they were right in their position, you know, 2 months ago or whatever,
sure.
other beginners talking to beginners, giving each other advice. And, and to find clear, concise, instructional content is really difficult to do on Facebook, I think. And I'm frustrated, honestly, that my website, I mean, I've had a lot of good content on there about getting started.
Hmm.
If you don't want to talk to me in person, you can read it. But I really want to make videos, I guess. And there are some good videos. I mean, many people have made good videos. I think
Yeah,
that's a
there are.
good way to go. So,
Yeah, there's some great people on YouTube nowadays trying to share good dart frog info.
yeah.
Hey, while you mentioned it, what is your we'll mention this now and then again at the end of the episode, but if someone is listening right now and wants to navigate over to your website, what's the URL? What's the website address?
Well, I had a website at saurian.net, SAURIAN.net for
Mm-hmm.
decades, 25 years or more. And then this is probably about the fourth or fifth time I've completely rebuilt the website to make it more, keep up with the times, so to speak. And the gentleman that helped me put it together recommended that I change my domain to a more search friendly domain, which is dartfrogsandgeckos.com. So if you remember Saurian or you see it, you can still go to saurian.net and that homepage will redirect you to my new website. Unfortunately, all the hundreds of pages at Saurian don't redirect you to
Right.
dartfrogsandgeckos.com. I'm not 100% sure I'm going to stick with that. But that's what it is.
Okay. All right. It'll be in the show notes, everyone. You can just click down there to get there. Check out his website. All right, back to some story time. The early 2000s had a pretty big boom in the hobby. That's when I got into dart frogs. I got my first Azurius and Aratus in 2002. And there was a lot of new stuff showing up. Like the hobby had already been established and around for, almost 20 years. But then in the early 2000s, lots of new Tinctorius, a whole bunch of Panamanian Aratus, and even thumbnails all entered the hobby. So tell us some stories about that sort of time of growth in the hobby.
Yeah, that really marked a huge expansion in the available frogs. I mean, if you go back into the late 90s, the list of dart frogs that you could possibly buy in the United States was short. 3 or 4 different Aratuses, 4 or 5 maybe Tinctorius. The yellowbacks. You had giant orange, you had Azurius, you had cobalts, and you had dwarf cobalts. And maybe I think Oyapox were probably present in the hobby at that point, but everything but like cobalts and dwarf cobalts were pretty rare and hard to come by. And Azurius, because of they really attracted a lot of interest. The availability of them eventually by the late 90s was pretty decent, but they were still pricey. There are a few thumbnails, but yes, starting in the early 2000s, a number of different things happened. The first thing, I guess, that happened was there was a real estate agent in Texas who had, a fair bit of money, and she got talked into somehow getting into importing dart frogs by this fast talking wheeling dealing kind of guy from Miami. And so how quotas work, right?
Yeah.
That the issue, so to speak, quotas for 200 Dendrobates tinctorius, let's say. And though that quota will only last for the year, it's good for 1 year. And so, it was always being dropped in the reptile and amphibian hobby in general back in those days that this is the last of the quotas. The last, it'd be like June, and this is the end. No more, Phelsuma clemeri are going to come out of Madagascar. No more, that's the last of the quotas. No more
Yep.
Dendrobates tinctorius are going to come out. Well, that was just the last of the quotas for that year. Next year they'll reissue. They might not, but they probably will. They have every year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, it was this, and so this woman's money funded a bunch of collection in Suriname of different morphs of tinctorius, and she named some of the morphs. The Patricia morph is named for her, and some of the other morphs are named. One of them is named for her daughter or something like that, and it was silly, and I don't know that it really drove that much interest was a thing. There were a lot of tinctorius that were available in the market. And for a while there, it probably inspired these, because once you do something like that, the infrastructure, so to speak, is there. You found the location for the species or the form, the locale, and then, the natural inclination is to go collect it again the next year. So that was a thing. Let's see. Then there was a gentleman named Marcus Brees who I really think other people probably should, but Marcus was a very involved individual who worked with Panama and Suriname as well. And he, I guess, helped bring in a lot of the Aratus morphs and things like that you're talking about. But then I think what maybe and maybe my memory may not be that great as well, but the later, like say 2007, 2008, in that
Yeah.
time, they really started to do this, and Marcus had nothing to do with this necessarily, but they started to do these larger exportations out of Panama, getting out to around 2010. Maybe they started these supposed breeding facilities in Panama, and that was basically a joke.
Right.
There was no breeding facilities, and that was a big kind of a stain
Yep.
on the hobby, I think.
And then eventually Panama sort of shut that down.
It did. As best I could figure it out, I think that it all had to do with the government. It is a democracy, and when the government changes, new governments may or may not
Mhm.
agree to allow, blatant corruption
Yeah.
to go on. And so when the farms were going on, there was corruption and people were being paid off to look the other way. And the frogs were just being collected,
Yeah.
out of the wild.
I'm a bit of a Dendrobates Aratus nerd. I really geeked out about the morphs and trying to track them all down. And what I learned was a lot of what came in like 2004 through Simply Natural Dart Frogs, those Panamanian imports. Who knows who was collecting those frogs
Or where.
or where? Maybe they said some of them were farmed, but really it was just a cover for wild collecting and exporting. And so the reason why so many Aratus don't have a locality name, they're just called turquoise and black, super blue,
Right.
micro spot. Like so many
Right.
of those Aratus, they just came in by the thousands, and it was probably Marcus who was like sorting through them and just doing the best he could to separate them out and give them names so that he could
Right.
sell them.
Well, yeah. Here's an example. And Marcus told me this story about the green Cipollini's.
Okay.
Right. So in 1997, a buddy of mine went to the Orlando Reptile Show, and I was living in Bloomington, and he calls me up from the show, and he's like, "Oh man, there's these tinctorius here that are just unbelievable. They're green, and blah blah blah." Anyway, long story short, I get the frogs, and they are very cool looking frogs, and I'm really super excited about them. And those frogs bred very, very true to their offspring, look just like the parents. But there was other frogs that were also called Cipollini's that did not breed true, that produced a wide variety of offspring. And anyway, long story short, or at least to move on to another part of the story, the frogs, obviously they were called Cipollini's. They came from supposedly the Cipollini savanna. But I had this conversation with Marcus about that, and Marcus is like, no, they don't come from there. Here's how that goes. Amerindians collect them and they bring them to Paramaribo, and sell them to starts with a T, the Tejo or whatever, the brothers that run the reptile exporting firm
Yeah.
out of Suriname. And they don't tell them where they came from. They just collect them. They bring them. They're tinctorius. They go out on the
Yep.
tinctorius paperwork. And then, people in the United States or people in Europe want to know where they came from. And so you ask the Amerindians and they say they won't tell you. And so then the Tejo brothers say, well, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, they came from, Cipollini. And so that's, how those locality names in those days would be given to like a frog like that. And it's funny because, and I have a little write-up on my page for the Cipollini's about this. Basically, the Lawa tinctorius is a new form of Tinctorius, and it's found quite a distance away from Cipollini savanna, and it's by a river, Lawa River, I believe, or a village named Lawa, one of the two. And they look just like green Cipollinis do. And they also happen to come in some different appearance. They go from yellow to green in their locality. And personally, I think that they are, I'm leaning toward the idea that they are green Cipollinis and that that's where they really came from. And that, you see that a lot now in the hobby where these locality, like the thumbnails in particular,
Yeah.
you'll see where they're very specific about where the frog comes from. What used to be the intermedius, Renitomia intermedius, is now some very specific locality name.
Yeah. And
And
that's probably thanks to Mark Pepper going down there and putting in some work to
right,
identify
right,
stuff. Yeah.
and some other people, but yeah, absolutely. And so frogs commonly came into the United States with very little locality information. All the Brazilian and French Guianan forms of
Hmm.
Tinctorius typically, I think, either came in from Suriname in shipments or they were smuggled out of those two countries to Europe and then brought into the United States as captive bred animals. But the Amerindians don't respect, why would they, border between
Okay.
Suriname and,
Yeah.
it's not a,
And Brazil, to them, it's artificial.
right.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Right. It's a
Um,
river.
all right. I got two follow up questions. One is going to be about Aratus. The newest morph of Aratus in the hobby is La Coca, which is a place on a map in Panama. You can Google Earth La Coca Panama, and it is a place. And we have some frogs in the hobby that are heavily reticulated, sort of turquoise and bronze. Do you?
I'm assuming that I'm probably the primary source for all the Lakota in the United States. Taryn lived in Wichita and I live in Kansas City. And well, since I've lived here since 2012. And so for the past 7 or 8 years, if he was getting a shipment, he was putting together a shipment from Europe, he would contact me with the list and ask me if there was anything I wanted. And,
Yeah,
I would,
nice.
right, exactly. And he would, he'd give me the animals at his cost plus shipping and things. So I would drive over there when these shipments would arrive. And, Taryn would be basically pulling in, or in some cases he would go to Chicago, pick up the animals, and I'd meet him here in Kansas City. He'd drive through here. And, the paperwork's right there. The boxes, the air bills are on the boxes. It's clearly freshly imported animals from Europe with, like I say, freshly stamped CITES paperwork
Okay,
for,
cool.
Galactinotus and Tinctorius and Peacock Tinctorius, stuff like that. Those Lacoca auratus came out of a box just like that. I watched them come out of that
Nice.
box along with, things like solid blue Galactinotus and Peacock Tinctorius and, Silverstone eye, you name it.
That's a
They
box
were,
from Europe or a box from Panama?
no, from Europe.
From Europe, yeah.
From Europe. So those frogs came from Europe. I know Taryn was trying to do things in Panama. I know he brought in some Pumilio. I don't know much about that. I never went in on any of the shipments that he did with the Pumilio because I just was done with Pumilio. And I've been done with Pumilio for a while. I just don't have any, I'm not going to work with them right now. Probably never will.
Yeah.
But the Lococa auratus were not described as Lococa auratus when I got them. They were just like the Rio Negro
Mm.
Lucamellis weren't described as Rio Negro. They had some other name on the list. And in fact, I talked to Taryn and I talked to Wouter in Europe and I named them. I don't
Yep.
the Rio Negros I'm talking about. Taryn contacted me sometime after those erratas came in, though, and said that he had, confirmed that as the locale for them because I was interested in knowing what the locale was, and so was he. Now, I don't remember. I mean, he just told me he talked to the hobbyist in Europe that had collected them, or I don't know. I really don't remember where that name came from in terms of what the provenance is, you know, but that's what he told me.
Cool.
And no, they look just like that when, I mean, obviously they came out of a box from Europe
Yeah.
and, I think they're a morph. And
Yep.
by the way, there's no similarity. I mean, any number of different erratas, go through the age progression where the bronzy areas
Mm,
on them turn bronze or white or whatever, and that's where you get the green and white erratas and
yep.
the green bronze erratas and things like that. These seem to the bronze areas lighten up relatively quickly, and as young adults, they look pretty nice. They're some of the nicest erratas that I've ever seen, but I see absolutely no indication that they're a line bred
Yep. Made up
frog or
something.
anything.
Cool.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
mentioned Pumilio. I remember on your website many years ago, you posted a rack of maybe like 8 tanks, and you were sharing with people. I have a couple different localities of Pumilio, and I think I got this figured out. I think we can breed these. And you were one of the first people in the hobby to start having repeated success breeding Pumilio. Why were Pumilio so difficult at first for hobbyists to keep and breed?
Well, that's a really simple question or answer.
Yeah,
So in the 90s, that was a staple frog of the pet industry was the strawberry dart frogs,
yeah,
blue jeans, from Nicaragua. And they would come in by the hundreds. They were cheap. And that right there is a central problem because they were cheap.
yeah.
So, you'd go to the pet store, they'd have a tank of these, attractive looking frogs that were, $12. And, you could buy, four of them and take them home and put them in your aquarium and, feed them. The pet store would probably tell you they ate crickets or something and, kill them. And that was over and over again. What people would do with them was take a number of them, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, whatever, put them in a tank. They would never breed because they were probably just all going to die to
Hmm.
start with. But then the hobbyists that would take a real interest in them and would keep them and try to work with them still probably didn't have much luck because they just didn't know the key, which is real simple, but no one really worked at it very hard. And by the way, they were blue jeans. And so as anyone that's kept more than a couple of different morphs of Pumilio knows, those Pumilio might as well be different species. So they all have the same call. They all have the same reproductive habit where they transport the tadpoles and they feed them the food eggs, but their personalities or their temperaments or whatever you want to call it is quite different from one locality to another. And the blue jeans are not an easy dart frog Pumilio form to breed. Um, so what, back in what was the timing of that? I guess probably
2000.
well, no, I'm thinking about what the timing of because I got a group of they were Costa Rican. They're from southern Costa Rica. They're all solid red. Puerto Viejo. Yeah, Puerto Viejo,
Okay.
I believe is what they are. And this guy named Sharif calls me, I don't know, he calls me up in like 1997 and says, I've got like um, 25 of these frogs. I've had them for a while, and I, that nobody else has any in the United States, and I'd like to. If somebody gave him my name, and I'd like to get rid of these, and so I talked to a hobbyist named Todd Kelly, and Todd Kelly is ancient godfather of the hobby, kind of. He's out of the hobby now, but
Yeah.
he was a supplier. He sent me a lot of frogs in the 70s, in the 90s, and very smart and calculating or whatever, a good hobbyist.
Yeah.
And I talked to him about these frogs, and I talked to Mark about these frogs before I got them, and I think both of them basically said, but Todd in particular, I remember telling me that he didn't have any experience with them, but that it would be his recommendation to keep them in pairs and that you could, sex them relatively easily, at least some of them. And if you kept them in pairs, they would do well and that they would breed.
Hmm.
And what do you know? I did, and they did. And, it was super easy. But, the males have a big dark spot on their throat and the females don't. Any frogs that process, that metric didn't weed out, you could spend some more time with individually sexing them out. But if you kept them in pairs, they would breed. And that's what that rack was all about.
Yeah.
that rack was mostly full of the red frog beach Bostamentos. So there was a guy, there was a guy named Bill Samples who lived in the Keys in Florida,
Hmm.
who sold me a lot of frogs over the early part of the hobby. He was less than, I don't, some of the stories I could tell you about that. But so anyway, Pumilio or many forms of Pumilio are easy to breed once you know the secret. And, yes, you can put a group of 4 or 5 of them together and some of the forms will be productive and you'll do well with them, especially if it's, like 1 male and 3 females or something. And
Yeah.
I know, I know that there are people that have, um, 12, 15 of them in decent size enclosures with lots of bromeliads. I remember back in the 90s, there was a guy in Germany named Eddie Potsma or something like that. And he was a big day gecko vendor, whatever you would call it. I don't know what his, the legalities and that sort of thing, but he sold a lot of day geckos. And my point is, he would get these shipments of day geckos from Madagascar and he would keep them in shower stalls. And he would have, 100 Phelsuma climeri, or not, that's not a good choice, gold dust day geckos or
Yep.
standings day geckos or and he would keep them in a shower stall and they would live there and they would breed there and they would coexist. Well, you could put 2 females, or I'm sorry, 2 males and a female in that same shower stall, and those 2 males would fight all day long
Okay.
until one of them was dead.
Yeah.
But you put 100 of them in that shower stall
Yeah.
and a bunch of cork tubes, and come back 2 months later, and the cork tubes are clogged up with eggs.
Hmm.
And the same thing. I've never personally been on the receiving end, so to speak, of this sort of generosity from the frog gods.
Yeah.
But because I've never tried it, I never had a dozen, Pumilio that I wanted to gamble with
Yeah.
and throw into a 90-gallon aquarium and see if they would do it. But I know people that have done it with thumbnails, and I know people that have done it with Pumilio, where they've basically kind of overcrowded them and they've been very reproductively successful. But that didn't work for much of anybody with the strawberry dart frogs that came in back
Yeah.
in the beginning.
I've never kept any Ufaga myself. I also remember getting calcium into the tiny froglets was a very big deal, and people were strategizing all about making sure the Pumilio froglets survived. What's the trick or key or basics for that?
Well, um, I think the main secret is to produce strong froglets. And unfortunately, I mean, uh, I I'd be happy to pat myself on the back for doing what basically no one had done in this country before, which is to breed a bunch of Pumilio. And I also acknowledge that other people helped me with it. But I would point out that I cherry picked and I went with frogs that, like the red frog beach,
Yeah.
cemetery, Bostamentos, the Porto Viejo, those frogs produced, reasonably sized offspring that were sturdy and came out of the water. They were still very small, but they weren't frail and weak looking. And some of the morphs I think that are in the hobby are much more difficult. And the people that, maybe deserve a bigger pat on the back are the people that have figured out how to, make the clay substrates that, and the springtails that I didn't have to work that hard.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Bosties and some of the forms that I kept.
Yep. All right. My next 2 questions are sort of about just the reality of having a very large dart frog collection. I'm curious, at what point in your sort of career as a dart frog hobbyist and breeder, when was your collection the largest that it has ever been? And have you since scaled back?
Well, when I was in St. Louis, I had over 200 tanks, 200 breeding tanks. That was just the dart frogs. There was also, a variety of other
Yep.
stuff going on. So that was definitely, the biggest that I, ever was. Since I do it the way I do it too, I've always believed in, never, age is not a factor, size is. So
Hmm.
if a 2-week-old froglet were ever big enough that I felt like it was big enough to be sold, I would sell it. I don't care that it's 2 weeks old. The point is that 2 weeks old, they're not big enough. So I keep most of my juveniles until they're 4 to 6 months old. And, in some cases, Oyapock tinctorius, let's say, maybe 6 to 8 months old or
Yep.
something.
So you have a lot of tank space dedicated to grow out.
No, I don't grow out anything in tanks like that. I grow out
Okay.
everything. Yeah. So that's my point, is that 200 tanks
Yep.
produces a crap ton of frogs, because you've got, first you got the tadpoles, then you got the
Hmm.
baby frogs, and then you got the juvenile frogs that are sellable, and then you've got anything that makes it past that size, you hold it back until it's sexable. So um, I wind up with, thousands of baby frogs on hand, or whatever, offspring,
Yep.
the stuff that's not in the breeding tanks. When I moved from St. Louis to Kansas City in 2012, I really cut back, and I kind of, wandered in the desert, so to speak, for a while there. But now I've returned my focus to kind of a mix of beginner frogs and more higher priced, rare terrestrial, regular dart frogs, and a few thumbnails. But I had a thumbnails going really well for me in the thousands, but
Yep.
I just haven't really been able to recapture that.
Sure.
So
Sure.
yeah,
Over the years, you've had an employee or two help you with all
yeah.
the frog care chores. Do you have a little bit of advice or wisdom for someone who's in a similar situation dealing with frogs, whether it's dart frogs or tree frogs or something? How do you make sure that that relationship works as far as are you good at delegating? Are you good at communicating? Do you set expectations with an employee? Like, how do you make sure that that sort of relationship works out for the good, for the better?
I've had so few of those relationships that, each one
Yeah.
is, its own little microcosm. I've had a couple of really good main employees, and then often I'll have like a secondary employee that just comes in and does like some, because usually I'll hire like the main employee to do like the cleaning and stuff,
Yep.
and then I'll promote them up to making fruit fly cultures, and then, next they get to do, um, you know, changing tadpoles or something. I'll just train one task after another. And, if they can make it that far and do things like that, um, we've gotten past the stage where there would be, I don't have to set expectations. The expectations were set early in the relationship, I guess. And the necessary work is obvious. And if they're going to be a successful employee, they're going to see those, they're going to know just as well as I do what has to be
Yep.
done. And if I'm not going to do it, then they're going to do it. And for better or worse, generally, I wind up giving all the day-to-day work to the employee, and I do the sales, the shipping,
Yep.
the acquiring new stock, or making sure that, the pairs are still pairs and whatever, that sort of thing.
Yep. Great. Do you think that there's like a perfect size collection for a dart frog breeder where it's enough work it's enough work for one person without an employee, but it's not overwhelming, but it still makes enough money to be a primary income? Like, does that perfect balance exist or is it sort of fleeting and impossible to find?
I mean, maybe the idea of it being the primary source of income is difficult. And, everything is based around a number, the number being the value of the frogs, the average price of the frogs that you're selling, and you can spin your wheels, producing $25 frogs, or you can, make, I mean, if I were to wipe the slate clean and, try to design a business that would do what you were talking about, I guess, you'd grab a big chunk of money and invest in a bunch of large obligates. And,
Yeah.
um, but, the reality is that to do this long term, I feel like you really have to get large enough to have an employee, because unless you're willing to do, you're just never going to leave your house
Mhm. Yeah.
for anything more than like a weekend. And that's just going to kill you.
Yeah.
That is
Right.
going to just wear you down. You can't do that for 5 years, much less 20 years, unless you're like, Mike Novi.
Yeah, I'm thinking of him, but he's shared enough with the community what it's like cleaning tree frog tanks. into 4 in the morning every single
Yeah.
day during breeding season. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike's a special case. I don't know how he does it, and he's a great guy, and
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
no, most people can't do that. I don't wanna do that, and, honestly, I'm at that point where I'm, looking forward to the next 5, 8 years, whatever, and thinking that, yeah, the end is out there. My wife's gonna, retire, and, um, she'll be expecting me to travel more than we do now, and, maybe move.
Yep. So yeah, all things to consider when you have 200 tanks of dart
The frog
frogs.
business is a ball and chain.
Yeah, sure, sure. What has it been like as a dart frog breeder in the past 5 years? Did you experience the boom in demand during the pandemic? And then have you noticed that the hobby's different since then?
You know, I, um, I did see an uptick in interest, but I don't know, it wasn't that big of an uptick in the frog hobby. I tell you, I made bank on, plants
Yeah, cool.
during the, pandemic.
Right.
I mean, I literally, I had a grow out tub that didn't have a light on it, and it had a, piece of Burl Marks, Fantasy that had done, like, 8 circles around the bottom of this,
Right.
grow out tub, and I took that and I cut it into about 2 dozen cuttings and potted them up, and, 6 months later, I sold them all for, like, $250 a piece.
Right.
I mean, just absolute lunacy. So, the frog business kinda continued at a similar pace for me, but I was busy making, a bunch of money off of these, varicosum,
Yep.
philodendron varicosum, and Burl Marks Fantasy, and a few other plants that I would post on. I mean, every week I'd post these plants on eBay or Etsy
Hmm.
for, I'd put up like 10 plants in little 2-inch pots that had like 3 or 4 leaves. Here's another batch and they were lovely little plants
Yeah.
for $225 a piece.
Yeah. I saw that too. Boy, that the plant hobby exploded during the pandemic. You're
It
right.
really did.
Yep. Crazy.
Really did. And it disappeared, like, it was like somebody turned off a light
Hmm.
sometime in, I don't know, like, June of 2022, just
Yep.
poof. It
Right
was
now in the reptile industry, the big sellers like bearded dragons, ball pythons, and crested geckos, um, the market is significantly down compared to 2020, 2021, 2022, um, because boom bust cycle with the pandemic, huge demand, everything was selling for thousands of dollars, but then all those people became breeders themselves, and now there's no demand. But I've noticed a lesson I learned in 2008 during the economic downturn was that the frog hobby did manage to it stayed pretty even keeled for as long as I've ever paid attention to it. I remember in particular 2008, 2009, I was just a small hobbyist. Maybe I had 100 frogs a year to sell, and I would just list them in the Dendroboard classifieds, and they would anything I posted in 2008, 2009 sold just no problem at all. While people were talking about, I mean, a lot of people did lose their jobs in 2008, but um, the frog hobby is a pretty small niche in the reptile industry, and there's something about it. Maybe it's the pace of growth, or maybe it's the type of person attracted to the hobby, or the addictiveness of trying to get more and more dart frogs. It has stayed, in my estimation, pretty even over the years.
it is. Frogs that are sought after at any given moment, or the frogs that are most heavily traded, varies, I think, from year to year. And I mean, I feel sorry for those people out there that are, I mean, God bless them, but that are trying to keep these forms of frogs in the hobby. I mean, it's, if you want to do that, it is on you, because
Right.
the hobby is fickle, and 2 years from now, whatever it was may or may not be as popular. But overall, like you say, I think the frog hobby stays, and it's a nice mix of, I have a lot of customers that, I just sent frogs out to a guy that I've been aware of and selling frogs to for 15 years. I've
Yep.
got plenty of customers that are in that same category. And then, but my day to day is more full of the people that I was describing earlier that, just found me. But first they found a bunch of information on the internet and they set up a terrarium and they bought a misting system
Hmm.
and they bought a bunch of isopods and springtails. And now they're like, hey, I need some frogs. You got frogs?
Right, right. Funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your website doesn't have tadpoles listed, so you have in-stock frogs listed.
I know, right? It's like, I don't get it.
Well,
I don't get it.
that's another interesting thing. You mentioned it earlier in this conversation, but I remember maybe 15 years ago or so where all of a sudden on your website there was regularly sexed pairs available, and you either commented on Dendroboard or maybe you commented on your own website that you're like, "Hey, I'm just trying to meet demand. I find that people are constantly asking me for sexed pairs. They don't want to put in the time to buy a group, raise them up, sex them, sell off the extras." So tell me a little bit about that trend. Is that still what you think hobbyists are looking for, or what do you think?
To be honest, they don't know that, yes, I get people who, are looking for that, but I also get people who, place an order for 4 Claw Mountain Tinctorius juveniles, and I have to reach out through the internet and
Yep.
go, "Hey, what the hell are you doing? You just spent $260 or whatever it was with shipping on 4, what are you doing?" "Oh, I'm gonna raise them and get a pair." Well, hello, for $225, I'll send you a pair of adults, and you won't have to go through the, you know, um,
You won't have to buy a second
frustration.
tank to
Right,
separate them
you're
out
not gonna have to
into.
raise them for months and
Yeah.
months and months and, and guess at what sex they are, and I get it, some people really do wanna do that. They
Hmm.
they do wanna see, and that's the same thing with the tadpoles. They wanna see the tadpoles come out of the water and,
Sure.
but I wanna see, here's where it really comes down to this, I could wholesale them.
Yeah.
Back when they were juveniles, I could have wholesaled them for 25 bucks, and sent them off to, whatever,
Hmm.
but overall, it's really not that much effort maybe to raise them and offer them as sex pairs.
Sure.
I'm the only person out there that regularly has them, so that's a nice, thing that sets me apart. And then I have them and I can talk because I mean, literally, I think probably half of the sex pairs that I sell go to people that didn't come to me looking for a sex pair.
Okay.
But but it's such a better, I mean, especially because they've already set up their tank and they're ready. What are you gonna do with those 4
Yeah.
juvenile tinctorius? Put them in that tank and, one of them is gonna die for sure.
Yeah. It's where they're going to end up anyway, is with two frogs in that
Right,
tank. So you're just helping
right.
them get there. Yeah.
Right, and, there's no guarantee that with 4, they'll even get a pair because they're beginners and they're gonna raise them together and yeah. It's like,
All right. I got two more questions for you and then we'll wrap up. In the modern world here, 2026, do you feel as a dart frog breeder that you have this need to compete for attention with sort of fast paced, the way information is shared online nowadays? Or are you able to sort of like rest on the fact that you're well established, fairly well known, and that customers can find you?
no, I cannot rest on that. In
Okay.
fact, I have been resting on that. I have been, but I have my breeding. I've been too successful with my breeding, and I have too many frogs, and I really am. I need to, no, I've done a terrible job of promoting myself. Most of the people out there, like if I jump on the Dart Frogs, the newbie Dart Frog
Yep.
Facebook page, those people don't know who I am. The only people that know who I am reliably are people like yourself that have been around the hobby for years, so I mean, Alex Minky is, I don't know how long he's been in the hobby. He's done an outstanding job of, promoting himself and being well known. Um, so hats off
Yep.
to him,
Yep.
and I'm seeking to emulate. So, yeah, back in, let's say, 2005, if you search for dart frogs for sale, I would come up. I'd
Right.
be in the top 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. I'd be on the first page of Google for most of the relevant terms. Now, I don't think most people or a lot of people don't search for dart frogs that way.
Hmm.
And if they do, they don't find me because I'm no longer on there. And the dart frog, new hobbyist quickly finds that the support groups and that sort of thing are on Facebook,
Yeah,
I guess. And so I guess I'm going to be on Facebook more because even though I don't really like Facebook, I've got to get out there and
sure,
get myself more well known.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the sort of customer funnel is nowadays. You're certainly established in the hobby though. Just in the first like 10 episodes of this podcast, 3 different guests out of 10 mentioned you by name as someone who they sought advice from or bought frogs from. So I guess in at least the circle that I'm floating in, like you said, in
Yeah.
the circle that
Well,
I'm
yeah.
in, yeah. But you're
Well,
right,
it's hard.
brand new people, they don't
Yeah.
know what they don't know, so yeah.
Right. Right. They don't. And like I say, I think Facebook is like having a chat with somebody at a bus stop or something. It's very kind of ephemeral. The contact is short, and you can come back, but there's not really a lot of information being transmitted there. And I don't really understand. I tell you what, I'll post something up on Facebook, a pair of frogs or something, and over and over, and I'll put my website, and over again, people contact me by Facebook Messenger.
Right.
How do I buy them?
Instead of just finding your website and clicking buy now.
Right. And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, they're on my website. And then they'll come back and they'll say, did you want me to buy them on your website? Yeah. How
Right.
else? Like what? What am I mean, I don't want to be, I'm not wanting to be the Amazon of dart frogs, but how do you shop for the rest of your stuff?
Right.
Do I mean, I get it that it's, I mean, I would prefer that it be a more personal relationship, and I'm happy to spend the time on Facebook Messenger or email or text or on the phone
Mm,
answering your questions. But I'm really frustrated by the apparent uselessness of having a website in today's world. And I put a
interesting.
lot of good information on there.
Yeah. So one of my sort of frustrations that I've been voicing on this podcast is how spread out the amphibian hobby has become in the last 10 years. Um in 2007, we all knew where to, like you said, even the Google search engine, there just wasn't as much stuff. So we all got narrowed down to one or two internet forums.
Right.
Um, and for young people who don't know what internet forums are, unlike Facebook and Instagram, what you post today doesn't just instantly disappear down the
Right.
list of things you're scrolling. So if Patrick posted frogs for sale or posted a thread where he shared advice or was listed under the vendors tab, he'd be found day in and day out for years. Whereas even if you did put in effort into the Facebook groups, whatever you post gets seen.
Right.
Whoever looks at Facebook in the next 2 or 3 hours sees it, and then no one ever sees it again. It's gone.
Right. Or should you want to go find it?
I
Like,
don't
oh,
know
I saw
how.
that post,
Right.
3 or 4 days ago. Forget it. I mean,
Right.
maybe, but it's the most frustrating thing trying to find.
Yep. Yep. Us old fogies, we don't like the social media. I'll see if
Yep.
I can get someone. There's some really wonderful Instagrammer and YouTubers who are putting out amazing content, and I'd like to get them on the show to pick their brains to see, for people like you and I, who aren't looking to like have massive social media followings, but just need to know how to use it to market our frogs. I'll see if I can learn
Right.
for our sake through the podcast. All right, my last question for you before we wrap up. Looking into the future, 5, 10 years, or even longer, the dart frog hobby, like the number of people in North America keeping dart frogs, do you see it growing? Do you see it changing in any way? What do you imagine is in store for the dart frog hobby?
What always attracted me to the dart frog hobby, the reason I landed on it above all was the fact that you could set up a environment and populate it with these animals and they would be active. They don't damage the environment. You put like a gorgeous pair of, you know, water dragons or something in you can't have any plants in there. They're going to
Yeah.
smash everything and they're going to, you know, splash into the water bowl or water feature. And it's so practical and manageable to create a little rainforest bubble in your home with dart frogs. And I really don't think there's any other uh, animal in the whole reptile amphibian world that's kept, or at least that are in the hobby that meets that description.
Yeah.
And so I think that, as our civilization, so to speak, pushes the, wildness or whatever you want to call it, nature further and further away from us. The 30 years ago, you could have walked out your front door on a June evening and seen fireflies in your front yard. And now you can't
Mm,
unless you're really far out in the woods. And so, like I say, we're just pushing this nature further and further away from us. To have this terrarium in your home is magical. And I know a lot of people that are in this hobby that started out as kids that went on
right.
to become researchers. And, so I think it really affects some people. And I think that it will always have a place in human habitats as long as, we continue on the way we are. So,
Right.
I don't really know how it's going to change on a larger scope. That's kind of what I see.
Cool. Yep, I agree. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Patrick. It's been great chatting with you. Maybe in the future, you'll have to come back on and give us some husbandry wisdom about a few specific frogs that you're known for, that people have been turning to you for advice on for quite a few years. But we can save that for a different day. So thanks
Yeah.
again. Remind us one more time, what is the website that people should find to shop for frogs or read some of your care information?
Yeah. So, Dart Frogs and Geckos is the website, or if you see saurian.net mentioned in forums and that, if you click on that, that'll take you from, that'll take you directly to the dartfrogsandgeckos.com. And, I'd love it for anybody that's thinking about getting into dart frogs. Read through my care sheets, contact me, talk to me. Certainly not the only person out there that can help you, but, if you go along picking up little bits and pieces of information off of the interwebs and use that to put your, hobby together, you're going to make a lot more mistakes than you would, I think, if you allow one person to kind of curate your introduction to the hobby. So a lot of the people that are doing this don't have time to really spend with their customers, I guess. And generally speaking, at this point, I can. So
Awesome.
come on down.
Yeah, that's something I noticed about you. Your website lists your email address and even your phone number. And a lot of your peers, similarly sized frog breeders, definitely don't list that information for the public. And then companies that are much larger than you, there's can get a human on the phone,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's a customer service representative who
Right.
doesn't have decades of experience themselves to give you the here's what you really need to know.
Right.
And so that's a huge benefit for people in the hobby, that you can actually talk to Patrick and people like him. And if you are new, that sort of real life human mentoring relationship is huge, because I said it before, you don't know what you don't know. And so even though you've done a lot of online research, which I'm not faulting, I think that's wonderful that there's so much content out there on lots of different media platforms. There's sort of nothing that beats just talking to someone else who has experience. So thank
Well,
you.
and
Yeah.
and again, so much. I know we talked about this before we started the podcast, but so to
Yeah.
speak to the public, there is a lot of information on the internet that is partially true,
Hmm.
but promoted beyond its value because it benefits the vendor that's promoting it or people that are promoting it. And I feel like there's a lot of misinformation. I go on forums and I see people talking about things that are not really relevant, not particularly important, but they have their tanks are well ventilated, bioactive enclosures with misting systems. None of that is all that helpful to getting you started with your first dart
Sure.
frogs.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So check it out. Reach out to Patrick, guys. Don't be shy. He's a huge resource in the frog community. And I was so glad to be able to chat with you today, Patrick. So thanks for coming on the show. Everyone, check out the
Joe, I
links.
appreciate you
Yeah.
having me.
Check out the
Thank you.
links in the show notes for the podcast and on YouTube. And just to make a mention, the times that someone shares this podcast in their Facebook or Instagram profile, it has the effect of quadrupling tripling or quadrupling the reach that the show gets. So more than clicking like, more than clicking subscribe, but if you share the podcast in any way, shape, or form, that's the number one thing that is effectively getting this podcast out to a bigger audience. So I rely on you guys in the audience to share the podcast to help it reach more people who are interested in frog content like this. Thanks a lot. See you guys next time.